Hi everyone, we're back, and this time we're having a look at phase 2. And the first thing we're doing is we're having a look at some basic principles for setting questionnaires, and then we'll go into more details. Now this is incredibly important to get right because the questionnaire forms the basis for our entire phase 2. Now, first off, there are two types of research. You get qualitative and quantitative research. Now we are actually focusing on the quantitative research, where we get numerical data, we ask closed-ended questions so that we can analyze quantities with functions. So even though we can actually ask things that's like yes or no, or what they like or don't like, we can still analyze the quantities because we can get numerical data from that. So we have structured data sets that gives us measurable statistics, and these are usually done through surveys or questionnaires. And we aim to get larger data sets. Now the other type of research, which we're not really doing, is our free-form data research. And that's where people can write their own answers. You sometimes do interviews with them. That's why it says spoken, done through interviews or group discussions. And this is where we have open-ended questions. Now, the reason we don't do this is because this is incredibly hard work. People who use this kind of research in the academic world need to analyze the words people used in their answers, and then they have to identify themes by manually going through the answers, unless they have artificial intelligence computers to run through the data, which we definitely don't have. So the data will be unstructured, it's not measurable, and they usually have a smaller data set, and it's much more intensive. So this is not what we're doing. So we won't be asking open-ended questions, please. Right, so in phase 1, what we did is we basically focused on the macro level. What does the research show about our topic? So we maybe found out what the statistics are, what the definitions are of specific things, and now we need to look on the more micro level in our specific community. What do people actually do? What are their behaviors? So do they actually travel? Do they stay at home? Do they spend time on their phone? Don't they spend time on their phone? What are their actual behaviors in their everyday lives? What are their preferences? Do they prefer cats or dogs? Do they prefer showering or taking a bath, in terms of if your survey was about saving water? So obviously you don't ask irrelevant questions, you ask questions that relate to your specific topic. And then you also ask their opinions. What do they think about other people who waste water? What do they think how important this thing is? That kind of thing. All right, so we ask their behaviors, about their preferences, their opinions, and we also ask demographic questions like their age, their gender, maybe their occupation or their education level. And the reason we ask all of this is so that we can see if we find patterns. We want to see, is there a pattern between age and behavior? Is there a pattern between the occupation and their opinion, how strong they feel about certain things? Maybe a specific gender has other preferences. So we don't just ask meaningless demographic questions. We only ask these things because we want to see if it actually correlates to the people's specific behavior, preferences, or opinions. Right, now, before you start setting your questions, please go back to the PAT document and check the topic again. It's every year we see the same thing. As you do your phase 1, you get lost. You focus on something that's actually not so important. Read through the topic and what they wanted you to focus on in the PAT document, please. So refocus. And then you can check your focus question in phase 1 as well, the one that you set, to make sure that you set questions on the correct topic and with the right focus. So just some warnings, because we don't want to lose our audience. We don't want people opening our form, starting to fill it in, and then they actually abandon the form. We really don't want that. So unprofessionalism is a big no-no. So as soon as you have poor spelling or punctuation, people won't respect the form. They might not even fill it in. And especially asking family members or people to share it, they won't be comfortable with sharing it with other friends or family or co-workers if it doesn't look professional. Questions also need to be clear. People can't be confused about what you're asking or what they need to do. Technical errors, like making a question required when everyone can't actually answer it. Something like, if yes, then what do you do? Something like that. You can't make a question like that required, because what if they said no in the previous question? Leading questions that aren't objective are also very unprofessional. You also don't want to overstep your bounds. So don't ask unnecessary demographic questions. Don't ask about their education if there's no reason to ask about that. Asking very personal questions like things about their salary and stuff like that. Don't ask that if you don't absolutely need it. And if you do, make sure that the form is completely anonymous and that you put some kind of disclaimer about what you're going to use the data for. In any case, nowadays with the POPI Act, it's a great idea to put a disclaimer at the end actually saying that they by submitting this form, they agree to this data being used for research. But really, putting the days of putting a name and a surname in a form is really unnecessary now. If you're not going to do anything with that information, don't ask it. And also don't make them feel like it's a test. Don't test their knowledge unless you're specifically telling them that's the purpose. So if you want to do that, put a heading in that says general knowledge test so that they know that's the thing, and don't make it feel overwhelming. Also be very careful and don't waste their time. If it's a questionnaire, a standard one, you're kind of expecting a questionnaire to take 1 to 2 minutes. So if it takes any longer than that, then you need to put in a note at the top that tells people how long they can expect to take by taking this questionnaire. You'll have seen that sometimes when it's an opinion poll or after you visited a hospital or something, they tell you that this survey will take approximately 5 to 10 minutes to fill in. If it takes longer than 2 minutes, you need to tell people that. Also, putting in open-ended questions that are a mission to fill in, or people have to think before they have to answer it, people just aren't up for that. They're not going to fill it in. And also going off topic, if they can see you're all over the place and you're not sticking to one topic, they're also not going to be interested and they're just going to close the form. Right, so let's have a look at some of these examples. Technical problems. As soon as you use these checkboxes in Google Forms, this means people can choose more than one option. So why do you do that for a yes/no question? That's wrong. So that shows that you don't know what you're doing. Be careful with scales. Negative statements are usually on the left and the positive statements are usually on the right. This just feels wrong. What your skill level was and putting bad on the right side, that just doesn't make sense. But on the other hand, you also can't just leave labels out completely. You do need to put in labels. You can't assume that everybody knows that 1 is the negative and 6 is the positive. Please put in labels and don't make the labels too long. Otherwise, it's not going to display correctly on a cell phone. Now, this is an example of a very unclear question. I have no idea what's expected of me by this question. How much do you shop online in a month? Very often I do shop. I don't even know if I must answer in numbers or if I must answer with text. Okay, so I have no idea what you're expecting of me with that question. Now, this one is a little bit better. How much do you spend on online food orders? But there's no timeline. It doesn't tell me per day, per month, per week. So I can answer virtually anything over here. So you won't be able to get any meaningful data from this when you analyze it in your spreadsheet, because how will you know what people had in mind when they filled this in? This is a good example of asking 2 questions in one, which you absolutely should never do. Are you using online platforms? If so, what platforms are you using? So this is an absolute no-no. You ask these questions separately. You first ask whether they're using online platforms, and then the next question, so the first one can be required, and then the next one, the if so, will be the follow-up question, which is not required, and then they can choose all that apply. Right, now this is an example of not respecting respondents' time. It's not like it takes long to fill in yes or no, but asking whether the COVID pandemic had an effect on the tourism sector is like asking whether the sky is blue. Everybody is going to say yes. There's no purpose in asking this question. Don't ask questions that's actually pointless and everybody's going to answer the same. And this kind of question is just going to overwhelm people. nothing. It's just horrible. Even though it says one word answer, what problems did you experience? Firstly, you're saying problems, and then I've got to give a one word answer. But asking me what problems did I experience and telling me it must be a one word answer, this feels like a test. And now I've first got to think, how am I going to phrase this correctly? This is just awful. Either I'm going to leave it open, or I'm going to put in an X, or I'm just going to close the form. All right, this is a good example of leading people, not staying objective. This is very bad. You don't want to guide or pressure people to a specific answer. This presumes that people do prefer to work from home. How much do you prefer to work from home? Don't do that. Ask people, how do you feel about working from home? And then they can actually choose. So the same for any kind of thing. It doesn't matter what your topic is. Don't let your preference show in your questions. And then the last one, just to show you, is you need to think ahead of what types of data you need. This question isn't terrible. The only problem that I can really fault it on is the fact that what do someone do that works, what would I choose if I work 30 hours per week? Would I choose number 2 or number 3? Okay, that's the only real issue. But the other problem is, if I leave my data like this, I won't be able to do very meaningful calculations with it in my spreadsheet program or in my database. So you need to think of what data types you need. For the questionnaire, I would recommend that you need text, yes, no, numerical, currency, and date and time. So text, it's nice when you have multiple choice, so people can choose 3 to 4 answers, different answers in multiple choice. And then checkboxes where they can choose multiple values, but it's better to have both. If you don't have checkboxes, that's okay, but please don't just have checkboxes. It's good to have multiple choice as well. So that's like, which pets do you have? Okay, no, checkboxes would be, which pets do you have? Multiple choice would be like, do you prefer to bath or shower? Okay. Yes or no is not a multiple choice. Okay, because this will actually become a data type in Access. So yes or no question, it's great, but that's not the only type you can ask. Numerical questions are extremely important so that you can do some of the calculations in Excel specifically. And you'll see you're going to need it in Access as well. So something like this hour question, or where you ask a specific spending habits, don't give them options to choose from that already includes words. Let them fill in an hour yourself, and then set the appropriate validation rules that they can't fill in words and that they can only fill in numbers. Currency doesn't always work for each topic every year, but sometimes it lends itself to it. So don't force it, but if it's possible to ask them how much they spend on something or how much they would be willing to spend on something, you can ask them currency. And please, if you do ask them about that, please specify a time frame. In a month, in a week, in a year, how once off, whatever, if they would donate or something like that. And then date and time if it's applicable. Otherwise, date also works great for asking their date of birth. All right, so some specific things you need to take note of that are requirements in the PAT in terms of your marks are, firstly, there's a mark that says there can't be any irrelevant biographical, or I call it demographic data. That's the more correct term. So there's no irrelevant biographic data. If you asked them to fill in their name and surname, even if you made it optional, and you did nothing with it, then it was irrelevant. Okay, so don't ask irrelevant biographic data or demographic data. There's one mark that says the spreadsheet contains additional data and analysis that is not from the survey. Now, I will guide you through this process. It's not very difficult to do. Basically, what you're going to do is you're going to look at something like, you'll probably take something from phase 1, where you, for example, checked what the statistics were on something like, let's see how many people actually recycle, for example. And then in phase 2, so in phase 1, you saw how many people in South Africa recycle. And then in phase 2, in your questionnaire, you ask your individual respondents, the specific people who filled in the questionnaire, you ask them if they recycle. So then in your spreadsheet, when you do when you do your analysis, you'll actually compare these two numbers, and then you'll see, okay, this is how much my respondents differ from the macro analysis in South Africa or wherever. All right. So this is not a very difficult mark to get, but it is a little bit of extra work. Now, the next one is very difficult. Not like you shouldn't be doing it, but this is hard work. So you need to decide early on whether you're actually going to go for this mark, because it's hard work for that. And that is that they want us to start to learn what the difference is for the type of data that you would use in a spreadsheet and the type of data that you would use in a database. So there's actually a mark that says that the data that you used in your database, in Access, is not the same as the data you used in your spreadsheet. Okay, so in our spreadsheet, we're going to probably use a little bit more numeric data. That's what we usually use a spreadsheet for, hey? To crunch numbers. And in our database, we'll probably use a little bit more text data, lots of our yes-no questions, because that's actually a data type in Access. All right, but I'm going to show you now what the specific requirements are for each of these programs, because you have to decide which questions you're going to use in which program, depending on that. So the easiest way to do this, the third bullet here, is you need to either ask 10 questions on your questionnaire instead of 5, and this is excluding your demographic data, or you can actually get an additional data source, and that completely depends on your topic and whether you've seen something like that can be easy to find. And then the last thing is that the database fields should be single data units. And that all that's about is, just like I showed you, don't ask double barrel questions. Don't ask them if they do something, and if so, what do they do? That's a double barrel question, and that's not a single data unit. Okay, so let's have a look at the specific requirements for each program. In our spreadsheet, the complexity, or the specific things we need to do in the spreadsheet in terms of the data that we need, is we need to do functions on our data. The functions we need to be able to do is one of each of these bullets. We need to do a sum, max, min, count, average, mode, median, len, or value on the data. So not all of them, just one. So I'm seeing, especially with max, min, average, mode, median, you kind of need data there that's numerical. Okay, and even if you don't have currency, you'll need some kind of numbers. So how long they spend on something, or a scale question works great for that. You're going to need something like that. Okay. And yeah, there's really nothing. I don't know what would be, because you lose your marks if you do meaningless functions. So it won't really help to count the number of characters in something with len or something. Right. The second one is the one we're going to be the easiest to get, is we can just use COUNTIF. COUNTIF we're going to use on pretty much anything they answered. We're going to count how many people said X, how many people said Y, how many people bath, how many people shower. Okay. The third one is also a little bit more complicated. We've got our COUNTIFs, some ifs. Really wouldn't recommend that one, but I'll walk you through it when we get there. We can use roundup or power, mid, those kind of things. But the big one I'd focus on here if I were you is a COUNTIFs. And this is fantastic for trying to look for patterns between our demographic data and specific questions. See if you can find a pattern between people's age and what they chose, or people's gender and what they chose. Something like that's a great combination. And then the last one, a lookup or a nested if function. Or you can actually use a function that's not in the curriculum. I always like using this because what do you actually do with a lookup or a nested if? You say, if something meets a specific criteria, then you want a text output, hey? Usually a text output or a calculation. But what works well is, like, if you say, for example, they spend a certain number of hours on social media, then they are a heavy user. If they use less, then they're an average user. If they use a maximum number of hours, then they are a heavy user. Okay, so there you have a nested if. Or with a lookup function, you could classify a scale. So you have two ends of the scale, but you can also classify the middle ones. So if it's a scale of 1 to 6, you can have a text value assigned to 1 to 6. So 1 is actually then bad, 6 is good, and 3 and 4 is actually neutral, whatever, something like that. But that works great for a VLOOKUP. Right, in the database, we need database validation. So you need a validation rule and validation text. You can probably do that on gender as well, but I find that usually numerical data just works the easiest for that. Here we need a list or a combo box. Now, that's why I said use a multiple choice question, okay? Because we can't use our yes, no here. Yes, no is a data type, which there's another mark for. So list or a combo box, this is why you need your multiple choice. And please, you can't use allow multiple values here. It's going to mess with things. I'll show you why. And then we need an appropriate input mask. Now, this is one of my pet hates. I don't really know where to use it, but the only place I've ever found where a really meaningful place is to use this for is on a date. So if you actually have a date that people had to enter, that's the best place I can think of to use an input mask. And then we also need to think of our queries that we're going to use. So in our queries, we need something with a simple criteria, like just extracting something that we're typing in. So people who didn't fill something in, we can do is null, or we can just like extract everyone who likes cats or something like that. And then we need a field with combined criteria, so with relational operators, an and or an or in one field, or especially like a range. So this works great with our scale question. Or a wildcard. So this is a great place to use our checkbox question where people could use more than one, could actually put in more than one answer. So that works fantastic for this because of the wildcards. Then we actually need a calculated field using arithmetic operators or a date and time calculation. So you need to either have their date of birth so that you can work out their age pretty much, or you need a calculated field. So you're going to need a number in here. Scale's not going to do it. So you'll probably need something like how many hours they spend on something, or how much money they spend on something, or something in that line. How many minutes they spend taking a bath. Okay, you get the idea. And then the last one is a grouped query. They do have other options as well, things like text functions, but that's not really meaningful. I can't imagine how you can use that meaningfully. So you usually would use this a grouping. So this is basically like using a count if, or a sum if, or an average if. So this is actually the easier one to do. It's where you're going to count how many people said this and how many people said that. Okay, so this number 3 is the one we need to look out for and make sure that we choose the correct data. Right, so good luck in setting your questions. Go have a look at your topic again, very important, and make sure that you have a variety of questions that you can use, but still respect your respondent's time. Make a good choice whether you want to put in 10 questions. So you need one section for your demographic questions, however many you need. And then after that, you need 5 questions that's specifically about the topic. If you want to do Excel and database together, or if you want to do them separate for that one extra mark, I'd recommend get 10 questions and make sure that you have a variety of data types.